something being morally good?
Um, well, I don't think that God can reliably ground what is morally good because of Euthyphro's dilemma. If good comes from God, then if God said that you ought to torture infinite babies, then you would be obligated to torture infinite babies. Would you defend that?
I wouldn't defend torturing babies, but that's because God says not to torture
Right,
babies.
but if God had said to torture infinite babies, would you defend that you ought to?
Well, the problem with the Euthyphro dilemma is that we're essentially importing that something we're if you distill it down to its most simplified version, it's essentially what if God said this thing that's bad is actually good? Would that thing be good? The problem is that we're defining something bad before we're defining good, so it's an undefined attribute because bad is
Well,
just the lack of
no.
good.
The distinction is that there is a strong intuition that people have that things like murdering babies is wrong.
Hmm.
However, if you presuppose that good comes from God, then you would have to say that if God said that you should murder all the babies, then you should murder all the babies. It's a question of whether or not God is capable of grounding moral decrees. Because if God is capable of grounding moral decrees, then anything that God says goes. If there are no external moral constraints on God, then God can say any moral claim and you would be obligated to follow it. If God said, go out into the desert, take a small child, and torture them for 40 years while cutting off like all of their limbs, you would be morally obligated to do that. Would
Sure.
you, do you think that you would be if God had said that?
I think the question is I think it's a logical contradiction in and of itself because we're assuming that God is capable of making two contradictory moral laws, and
Okay.
and then we're reasoning to this conclusion saying, hey, this is contradictory, therefore the thought of God is absurd, but it's really the premises.
Well,
Like
can God
it,
I mean if goodness is just an arbitrary thing that we attach to God, divine decrees, then divine decrees can change. Like the same way that if God just makes a table, God can turn that table into a chair, presumably. If God makes one moral edict and then he says, no, I'm tired of that one, he can presumably change it, right?
I think it would be fallacious to attribute sort of human contradiction to God's what we're calling word. It could really be
Wait,
some
but
other
you're the one
attribute.
who invoked it being logically contradictory.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that when we say suppose God says X, we're assuming that when God says something, it behaves the same way that a human says something. So if God says I like tacos and then the next day he says I hate tacos, there's nothing logically contradicting about the concept of that, or so we think, because there's nothing logically contradictory about the concept of me saying those two phrases. The problem
So
is that when you posit God as the source of all universal objective absolutes, you're essentially saying, suppose that the source of objective universal absolutes says something contradictory, then we get into a logical contradiction
well,
because the
no,
source
it's
of logic is contradicting,
no,
is what we're
it's saying
supposing.
something that changes over time, right? So first he said one thing, and then he changed his mind and said something else. I mean,
You
you
can make an
could,
algorithm, yeah, sure.
well, you could imagine things that are correct that God creates,
Hmm.
that are contingent truths that are contingent on God, changing based on the will of God. So if God makes the
Sure.
universe, God could completely redesign the universe, and that wouldn't be a logical contradiction, even though they're both things that stem from God. If morality is the same way, of it's just God says X, thus you ought to do X, then if God changes his mind about what you ought to do, then you have totally different moral decrees, and it's okay to kill babies.
Sure. So when I say God says X, I'm not defending the idea that God has to be creating morality and logic and mathematics and the laws of nature using like actual words. It's just a way of compartmentalizing in my brain the idea that God has defined these things. And I don't know if he does it with his nature, as some people will say, or if he does it with his kidney, for all I know.
Yeah,
But the point is that it comes from God. So it's not necessarily that we can say, oh, what if God said not X, but he also said X? Wouldn't that give us this moral contradiction, this moral dilemma in ourselves, which is a contradiction with the laws of morality? And the answer is no, because we are presupposing one set of morality, and then we're examining this other set of morality. But this other set of morality can exist if we're supposing the first set of morality. That would be a
well,
logical contradiction.
sure, but it's not a logical contradiction the changes from the first morality to the second morality. So if God originally makes the universe such that it's wrong to murder babies, and then he says, I'm changing my mind. I think it's okay to kill babies now, right?
Sure. So do you think it's a logical contradiction to ask, can God create a rock so heavy he can't lift it? Is that a logical contradiction?
Yeah, I think that is a logical contradiction.
Okay, because it's essentially the same thing. Instead of a contradicting law of nature, you're talking about a contradicting law of morality. You're saying, can God create good that's bad?
No, it's not saying that can God create good that's bad. It's can God make something that was at one point good that is now bad. So it's like saying, can God make a rock that is 500 feet, and then can he make it into being 1,000 feet? Well, it can't be both at the same time, but it used to be one. It became the other. No contradiction arises. Likewise, it used to be the case that one thing was moral, then God changes his mind. If good comes from God, then if God changes his mind, then what you ought to do changes based on what is presupposed to be good.
Sure. So when you say suppose a rock 500 feet long or however, we're not examining a law of nature. We're examining something within nature that just sort of manifests itself as the result of the laws of nature.
Well, but the same thing would have said,
suppose an entirely different set of universal objective absolutes. So the laws of morality aren't a manifestation of morality. They are the actual system that we're talking about. So it's sort of the same way if we were to say, suppose God made a new law of logic. Can he just do that? Well, yeah, but that would be contradicting for our point of view because we're navigating logic to get there. It's the same way.
No. So, again, you said that it's analogous to a law of nature. So if that's true, like God could change the laws of nature, presumably. God could make gravity stop working, I would assume, right?
Sure, but describing that coherently is a little bit difficult.
Well, but again,
like, can God? Let me put it this way.
Sure.
Can God make a red blue? Essentially, can God make the color blue, but it's red?
No. So the distinction is that in that case, you're presupposing that something is P and not P at the same time. In the case that I'm giving,
exactly.
You're saying no. But the distinction is, could God make? In this case, it's in different points in time. So it's not can God make something that is good and bad at the same time. It's this thing that we think of as bad right now. Mm-hmm. If God just changed the moral laws of the universe, could God make murdering babies moral?
Sure. It's sort of the same thing as this thing that we call red right now. Can God make it blue? It gets into really dicey kind of definitional language where if God just created a universe where all red things are blue and all blue things are red, there would be no logical problem with that. But if God sort of just takes red and makes it blue, that's a logical contradiction. So it's sort of the same.
No, it's not. I mean, if God snapped his fingers right now and turned my shirt blue, and turned your shirt blue, and turned everything else in the universe that's red blue, and turned everything that's in the universe that's blue red, no contradiction would arise.
Sure, but he wouldn't be making the red blue. He would be making the things that are red blue. In other words, because red's already been defined, we can't take it and then use the opposite to define itself.
Right, and in this case, he's making things that are moral immoral, or things that are immoral moral. He's not making the morality immoral. He's making the things that are moral or that are immoral moral.
So you're talking about not the process by which we achieve the values. You're talking about just straight up flipping the values.
Sure.
Okay. Then I mean, he could call it a different thing. Yeah, sure. That would be fine. But it wouldn't be
the question of calling it a different thing. It's a question of there are moral absolutes or there are moral rules. You think that God could just make murdering babies okay.